Okay, very good. Okay, and the Facebook is rolling. So we're going to start, and then I'm sure people will be following us as we, as we continue here. All right, so welcome to the Journal-isms Roundtable. My name is Richard Prince, and I read an online column called Journal-isms. That's journal-isms.com. I'm also admitting people here as we talk. Okay. I read a column called Journal-isms, which is about diversity issues in the news business. And this roundtable is an extension of that. We started the roundtable in 1999 when a friend of ours was leaving to pursue a doctorate. She said, just keep these going while I'm gone, and we have. We met every month at various restaurants in Washington, D.C. until the COVID pandemic, I should say, when we moved to Zoom. Our participation multiplied, and we hope to have more roundtables that are hybrid, meeting in person as well as having people attend via Zoom. We've had 2 of those so far. We think of this as an online dinner party with the purpose to network and to learn. Some of the networking takes place in the chat room, so please feel free to make use of it. I've already put a couple of messages in there. A special welcome to the people on Facebook. Please leave messages in the comments section if you have something to share with the rest of us, or just to reach us. Our topic tonight is, what can the case of the Central Park Five, now the Exonerated Five, teach us about media coverage of crime? Have the media improved their coverage of crime since then? We're fortunate to have with us experts in this field, and we're going to get to them in a second. But first, we want to raise a toast to 2 folks who deserve to be toasted. Let's see, is Randall here yet? Randall Pinkston, and also Andale Gross. We want to honor them. Well, they'll be here momentarily, I guess. In the meantime, back to our topic. I want to ask David Kreizer and Elinor Tatum to respond to the question, what can the case of the Central Park Five, now the Exonerated Five, teach us about media coverage of crime? I'd like them to limit their comments to 3 minutes, since we have a lot of speakers. David Kreizer was the attorney for Korey Wise of the Exonerated Five. And I'd like David to tell us about what the media coverage was like from the viewpoint of those who were accused. David, floor is yours.
So I was
good to see you.
Good to see you. Nice to see you in person.
Yeah.
I will correct you and say that I was one of the attorneys for Korey Wise.
One of the attorneys. Okay.
I invited one of my former partners, Jane Byrialson, to join, but she's prepping for a trial that starts later this week. So I don't know if she's going to be able to jump on, but hopefully she does.
Okay.
So when I saw your email and I was thinking about how to answer the question, I sort of thought about answering it this way. When the Central Park jogger case came out in April of 1989, or when the jogger was actually attacked, I was 9 years old.
Wow.
Yeah, so I certainly wasn't a lawyer then. I wasn't even in high school or middle school. But I was trying to think back as far as what other cases, besides the OJ trial, which everybody followed, but what other cases I remembered being that young. And this is the only case. And the case was so sensational. And there was so much media coverage that even at 9 years old, and I lived in New Jersey, so not far from New York City, that I knew what happened. I knew that a woman was raped. And I think the most longstanding thing that stayed with me was that you didn't go into the park at night. You didn't go into Central Park at night. Even into my 20s when I moved to Manhattan, that was still sort of the thing that sort of resonated with me from that stuck with me. The interesting thing is that, you fast forward to 2008, 2009, when I was approached along with Jane and her husband, David Fisher, to represent Korey. I had no idea that they were even exonerated. So when you're talking about until I was told, hey, do you want to represent this guy? This is what happened. Do you remember the Central Park jogger case? So what really struck me, or what I started thinking about it, was at least at that time, the media was so frenzied and so much about making this story. And then when the truth finally came out, it's the same person that at 9 years old knew everything about the case. I had no idea that they actually didn't do it. So it took me being approached as an attorney to represent somebody to actually find that out. And I thought that was sort of very telling of the media coverage then, and then how everything sort of developed, 10, 12 years later, once they were finally exonerated. But to answer the specific question, has it improved since 1989, 1990? I would say that it has improved, but I would use the word mildly. And I use the word mildly because I think society as a whole, we still love that sensational story. We still love to hear what happened, or to have that "we got the guy" moment. And I think the media, to some extent, feeds into that. At least in New York, we still love our perp walk, right? I don't know where everybody else is from, but when there's a big case in New York and somebody is arrested, or the main suspect, they've been doing it for probably 40 or 50 years, do that perp walk in front of the courthouse on Center Street. And it's almost like a rite of passage for that criminal suspect. So I don't think I've seen a case that's been that much of a media frenzy since. So I'd like to think that the media coverage has certainly improved. But going back to that original point that I made, that I would like to see more. I don't want to use the word retractions or apologies, but when something comes out where maybe the person that they originally arrested or alleged to have committed a crime is proved innocent or is exonerated, I would certainly like to see more coverage in that vein. I think it would certainly complete the circle, complete the narrative, and do a better job of informing the public.
Well, that's certainly a topic that some people in the media have discussed about what to do if the person turns out to be innocent. Is there sufficient coverage? And even some people want to know whether the original stories can be excised from the archives online. Right. So that's not everybody agrees on the solution, but that's something that has been discussed. Now, I want to ask Elinor Tatum, who was there as publisher and editor-in-chief of the Amsterdam News while all this was going on. And today she's come up with another possible solution to improving media coverage with a project that examines gun violence in the Black and Brown communities. So I'd like Elinor to take 3 minutes to give us her answers to those questions. And welcome, and I'm glad you made it.
I'm so glad to be here. Well, and I wasn't quite publisher yet. I was 18. Sorry. I was 18 years old.
Oh, okay.
I was a senior in high school in New York City when the case happened. Mm-hmm. And my father was publisher of the Amsterdam News at the time. So I did have a front row seat to it going on. And the one thing that I remember the most clearly about that case, about those first few nights, was my father adamantly saying that these boys did not do it. And him saying that their sneakers were clean. And the Amsterdam News's position throughout the trial, throughout their incarceration, was They didn't do it. And the Amsterdam News fought against the media's basically media lynching of these 5 young men over the next years, next decade and a half almost, until their exoneration. The Amsterdam News was vilified for their support of the exonerated 5. My father was taken to task on so many different levels. The Amsterdam News was taken to task, but day after day, the Amsterdam News said that the evidence does not show that these boys did this, and that the media was going after them because they were the lowest hanging fruit and they just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the way the media hung on to it and created the whole term wilding from it was disgusting. And the fact of the matter is that to this day, they will still, the media, and unfortunately, it continues to happen. If they find somebody that they can attack and blame that cannot defend themselves, they will continue to do it. And unless there are outlets that will not go along for the ride and will be the better part of wisdom and will be that voice, it will continue to happen. And yeah, there might be some modicum of improvement in some places. It's still going on. And, and it is true, the Exonerated 5, there are probably some people that still don't know that they have been exonerated, and they will always be the Central Park 5 and not the Exonerated 5. But, from the moment it happened, the Amsterdam News stood by those 5 young men and said something else happened here. And what's very interesting is when you look at those stories that were written about the exoneration, it never even actually mentions the fact that there were just a few media outlets. It was mostly the black press. It was actually only the black press that said that they didn't do it. But there's actually also no mention of that either. So without the black press, I don't even know if this would have ever even come to light.
All right. Now, among the people who don't acknowledge that they are now exonerated, we have to mention that one of them is Donald Trump, who famously took out an ad, a full-page ad in the New York media, suggesting that the death penalty for those guys, and to this day has not admitted that he was wrong. So that being said, we do have now our one of our honorees. We have Andale Gross, and I don't see do I see Randall yet? He must have gotten tied up. But anyway, Andale was for a number of years recently the head of the race reporting unit at the Associated Press, and he has just been named, and he started already as managing editor of the Kansas City Star. So we want to toast Andale and hear a few words from him about what he's learned in those couple of years when he was running the race coverage for AP. So let's raise a glass to Andale Gross and congratulate him and wish him well in his new job at the Kansas City Star. Hear, hear.
Here, here. Sorry, I don't have a cup with me. I'm so sorry.
That's okay. All right, Andale, we are curious about, here you are running the coverage of race for the Associated Press. What did you learn after having this experience? What can you tell us that from about how to improve what we're doing from from your experience at AP?
Yeah, I mean, when I first started, we hit the ground running because right after I got appointed to the position the end of 2019, and I brought on a newly formed team of folks, and then the pandemic happened. And then not long after that, we started to expose the racial disparities when it came to how people of color, particularly Black people and Latino people, were impacted by the coronavirus. And then George Floyd was murdered by the police in Minneapolis. And then we had the election with Biden versus Trump. And then, as you guys recall, on the heels of that, the January 6th insurrection. So it kind of just, the news cycle just kind of happened for us. And we were kind of thrown into, these back-to-back really big race stories. I'd be remiss to say that, the race team at AP did not start with me. It was actually Sonia Ross, an editor based in Washington. It was her baby, and there was other folks with Sonia, Jesse Holland, Aaron Haynes, and others who started the original iteration of the race team. And then when I came on, we kind of revamped it, added some new people to it, kept some of the same members as well, and just kind of forged ahead. The thing I learned about race coverage that I didn't think too much about when I got the role was just how much I would have to push, and my team would have to push to get taken seriously around wanting to tell really more in-depth stories about racial disparities, systemic racism, how racism permeates every institution you can even think of in America, from hospitals to schools to financial institutions to the military. There seemed to always be an appetite for stories that were reactionary and, reacting to racist incidents and things like that. But when it came time to really dig into something more in depth that we wanted to do, there was always, we had to get buy-in for it. I think over time we wore folks down, and they started to believe in what our own vision for ourselves was. And that led to really great projects like Kat Stafford's From Birth to Death, a lifetime of disparities in Black Americans, which ran at the end of May. And so now I think, we kind of set a standard for that kind of coverage. And I think that AP and hopefully others will start to really kind of delve into it, because really with racism and race, it's about telling stories about the inequities that the Black people and other underrepresented people in this country face on a daily basis, and really kind of connecting the dots between things we've seen in the past, things we're seeing currently, because it's all the same. It just might look different, right? I mean, we're still fighting for equality in our voting rights. We're still dealing with racist attacks against people of color. We're still dealing with so many things that was dealt with in the past, police brutality, that is still occurring in real time. It may just look different in the case of, these invisible white supremacist bullies we see on the social media platforms, but it's all the same. It's just maybe in a different form. So, what I learned is in order to really, have authentic race coverage, you have to really kind of continue to fight for what you feel like the coverage should look like, and really just stick to that and try to be true to the stories. And lastly, I'll say that I think that, it's important to have race teams and race coverage, but I really feel like it's a responsibility of news gatherers across different news organizations to tell race stories. So no matter what your beat is, whether it's health or education or sports or whatever, if a race-related story lands on your beat, you should cover that story. It shouldn't be incumbent on just the journalists of color or just the race teams to cover this stuff. This is all of us have ownership and stake in these stories. And those who don't feel like they have the expertise, or those who aren't comfortable telling the stories, they need to gain the expertise and gain the comfort level, because these stories aren't going anywhere, and they're they intersect with everything across the coverage areas that we cover. It's race is involved. So it was a really good experience. I'm glad I was able to do it. I feel like it's prepared me in a lot of ways for tackling this new role as ME in Kansas City. First Black ME in the history of Kansas City Star. I was telling folks are asking me how I felt about that. I mean, it's great to be mentioned in historical context, but it also is sad at the same time that in 2023, we're still having all these firsts when it comes to African Americans in this country. But I'll take it and hopefully build from there and then we pass it on, for the next, right? But thanks for this opportunity to come here and thanks for the toast. I really appreciate it, Richard, and everybody else on the call.
Here. All right, we have time for just a couple of questions before we move on. Did I see Melissa's hand up? No? Okay. All right. Anyone have any questions for these provocative things that Andale is telling us? If not, we can move on to the next and get back to our main topic. Okay. All right, Angela. You can put them in the chat if you have questions for Andale or for anybody else for that matter. All right, back to the Exonerated Five. I'd like to hear from the Marshall Project now. Carroll, Bogert, and Susan Chira are here, and their mission is covering not crime in particular, but the criminal justice system. So I'd like to hear for your 3-minute takes on what has taken place and what needs to be done and where we are now. So Carroll and Susan, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Richard. It's an honor to be among you and such an important topic. The Marshall Project really was founded out of a sense that the media had not done a good job covering crime. And even more than that the media had paved the way for mass incarceration, had facilitated mass incarceration with a lot of the overblown, hyperbolic, racist coverage of the issue, particularly in the 70s and 80s and 90s. We published a story a couple of years ago about the word super predator. This comes after the Central Park jogger case. It's a few years later. It's a term that's coined by a Princeton University professor called John DiIulio. It caught on like wildfire. We actually tallied the number of times, hundreds of times, that term was used and reused by the media. And I want to say, in all transparency, at the time I worked for Newsweek magazine. I'm happy to say the term super predator never appeared in my coverage, but it certainly appeared in Newsweek magazine. And instantly, after the term was coined, it was published, it was a cover story in a new right-wing magazine in Washington, but it really got a lot of pickup. And particularly on the op-ed pages, not so much like the beat journalists who were covering crime. They were doing their own kind of damage. But I mention it just because it is an animalistic term, and it built so much on the words, wolf pack, wilding, this language that was really introduced widely into the kind of lexicon of our country by the Central Park jogger case. And I think one of the interesting things about that case was that, it was a terrible sexual assault. Assaults of that nature, honestly, were occurring all the time around America. That one became national news. And when you look at the coverage of crime of, let's say, the 3 networks, those of you who are old enough to remember when the 3 networks were all that mattered, because there weren't any others. There wasn't cable news. There was CBS, NBC, and ABC, and a couple of locals and a little public TV. But if you look at their coverage of crime, it's very slight in the 1990s, and it balloons over the course of that decade. So crime becomes a national issue. The Central Park jogger case, which is a local case, becomes a national issue. It's covered by outlets across the country. The 94 crime bill, of course, has also made crime a national issue. For the first time, it's really being taken up by the president. There's a national debate about crime. And all of this really turbocharges the coverage. and really helps to, again, spread this kind of imagery, this kind of language, enormous fear. But I think it was very important what was said earlier, about the Amsterdam News, and that's not the only one. I'm from Chicago, and I happen to really look into the Chicago Tribune and the Chicago Defender and how they covered this era differently. And I spoke to one of the people who covered crime for the Chicago Defender at the time, and he said, we would never have used the word super predator, never. He had an interesting take on that. He said, the Chicago Defender, its offices were in the neighborhood. We were on the second, he said, I was on the second floor. People could actually reach up to the window where I sat and knock on it if they didn't like my coverage. The Chicago Tribune was in a skyscraper isolated from the city, where a highly not diverse newsroom made editorial decisions about how crime was covered in that city. And they loved the word super predator. They reprinted that John DiIulio article in full on the op-ed page of the Chicago Tribune. They used the term repeatedly, their columnists, and that just would not have happened at the Chicago Defender. So I don't mean to suggest that the picture is rosy today. Susan Chira's wonderful newsroom is doing everything it can to inject a more balanced view of these issues into our national dialogue. I did clock that when a young woman, I believe a Barnard or Columbia student, was attacked in Morningside Park a year or so ago, the names of the alleged perpetrators were not used. The term alleged was used. You may remember that in the Central Park jogger case, though somehow the word alleged just magically disappeared, although these children were pre-trial, had not been convicted. I think there are some lessons from the Central Park jogger case that have been learned. I don't want to overstate that because we just lived through the midterms. We just lived through a hyperbolic, overblown, quote unquote, debate about crime rates in America that was pretty untethered to the facts in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
So I don't mean to suggest that we're over the problem is behind us. It's very much with us.
Right.
I
And
hope, that the way certain young men are described, there's a little bit more sensitivity, in part because there has been a certain amount of recognition of how terrible the media coverage of the Exonerated Five was. Sorry, Susan, take it away.
Oh, no, I was going to say, just picking up on Carroll, and Carroll is too modest to say that this article was written by her and a colleague of hers who've been looking into this and doing really fantastic research. But just to sort of look forward now, as Carroll said, the Marshall Project was founded in part because of a real alarm that mainstream news media, or whatever word we want to use, was giving insufficient coverage to the results of mass incarceration. What was happening inside prisons and jails, what were the rationale and consequences of the harsh sentencing that was brought into life under the 94 crime bill, and what were the systemic issues that created such an abusive criminal legal system. And so I think there are a couple of things in terms of, I guess, we know we're not perfect and we wouldn't claim to be, but I think there are a few things that we try to pay very close attention to, and we hope to be a model and a help to other news media who want to avoid falling into the same traps. So one issue, as Carroll mentioned, is that we have a very robust data department, and we consider it part of our responsibility to try to give context to crime statistics and try to, fact check and contextualize crime rates. As you know, in the midterms, a lot of claims were made. And it was true that after a long bout of steadily falling crime rates, during the pandemic, you did see sharp rises in certain kinds of crime in certain places. But we dug in and wrote a great deal about, well, these kinds of crimes were up and these kinds of crimes were down. And one of the things that you learn when you cover crime is that despite what politicians say, criminologists and people who study this have never really been able to satisfactorily explain the causality. What really causes crime rates to rise or drop? There's never really been any valid scholarly analysis that can account for it. It's very difficult. So we tried to really look at what the data said and what it didn't say. And we have also made a huge effort to help spread that in local markets where a lot of the coverage can be, they don't have necessarily the access to some of the data analysis that we're able to do. So that, for example, one of our reporters analyzed the national crime statistics collected yearly by the FBI, and the FBI had changed to a new system. And lo and behold, in the first year of the system, you know, a massive percentage, almost 40% of major police departments did not, in fact, they were not able to submit data, or they did not submit data to the FBI crime statistics. So those crime statistics left out many of the major cities and major states in the country. So the crime statistics were deeply inadequate. And so we looked at, we made our database available to a whole range of localities, and we partnered with Axios, and they did stories depending on where they, you know, had their teams and newsletters that looked at which areas, how they performed on, you know, their transparency of crime statistics. So I think one thing that the news media can use is really careful analysis of data that tries to fact check and curb hyperbolic rhetoric that is, you know, designed to incite fear, but is not factual. Another thing that we really care a lot about is language. We have something that we developed called the Language Project. One of our editors this was inspired by a guy who was incarcerated, but is now out after a long, long time, Rasan Thomas. A number of our editors went to prison where he was in California and met with him and other people and heard their concerns about the language used to describe both people incarcerated and others. And so we put together a list of principles that we share with other news media that guides what language we use and avoid when referring to people in the criminal justice system. Because one of the lessons of the Exonerated Five is that if you dehumanize people, if you equate them to animals, or in other ways deny their humanity, it's very easy to demonize them and think of them as not human. So language is an important tool in that. And we have given, you know, we've talked to many newsrooms about our principles. We have shared them with a lot of people. We talk to the AP and hope that they'll adopt some of them. So that's on our website and available. So those are just, I don't want to take up too much time, but you try to think about what tools you can use to help people who may not realize, you know, some people really may not realize that some words that sound neutral to them are actually experienced as insults. For example, the word.
So can you give us some examples?
Yes, exactly. So, for example, there's disagreement about it, but we avoid the word inmate. Some people may think that's very neutral, but what we heard from people who were incarcerated is that in many cases, the corrections officers would shout at them and use the word inmate or their number as a way of dehumanizing them. And it brought up those memories. So some people see that as neutral, but the people who actually experienced it as dehumanizing. And there are other words you can use. You can use prisoner. You can use people behind bars. You can use incarcerated person. Their other principle is people first language. We don't say felons. We say people convicted of felonies. We try to remind people that these are people. So we have other lists of words we avoid and we don't, but we don't always use words that some champions of certain causes want, because journalism, as you all know, is a discipline of clarity. And so one area that we parted ways and we understood that some people who have been formerly incarcerated feel very strongly they'd like to be referred to as returning citizens. And I understand that because they're returning citizens, but we don't use that because I think it's very easy for people to think this has something to do with immigration. It's confusing. it doesn't really clearly say what it is. So we try to do our very best to take into account, words that are not insulting, and then be as clear as we can with those who read or listen or watch what we produce. So those are just two examples of things we try to do at the Marshall Project, in addition to the fact that, as Carroll said, our very mission is to look at systemic abuses in the system, racial, gender, economic, whatever they be, and document them so that they cannot be waved away. Happy to cede the floor.
Thank you, Susan. I appreciate that. That was good. Now we have Dan Shelley, who leads the Radio Television Digital News Association. And as most of us know, more people get their news from television than from print. So what television does is very, very important, particularly in a subject like this. So I want to ask Dan for his 3 minutes to talk about has television changed its coverage of crime since that time? The use of mugshots, the use of words. What's your analysis of that, Dan?
Well, first of all, Richard and everyone else, I cannot and will not defend local media's coverage of the Central Park Five, the Exonerated Five case, back when the crime happened, during the subsequent judicial proceedings, and even to this day, because I do think in retrospect, many mistakes were made, many ethical breaches occurred. I think journalists of that era probably did cause a lot of harm through their coverage. I don't excuse Elinor for one moment the fact that no one gave the Amsterdam News and other Black media outlets credit for saying "we told you so" when the exonerations occurred. But I will say this, the industry is hyper-focused on these kinds of issues today. The industry is trying to make some significant improvements. It starts with hiring more people of color to staff local newsrooms so that they truly reflect the communities that they serve. We've seen significant, but not significant enough improvement in that area, particularly post George Floyd and post 2020 and the racial reckoning that occurred as a result of that, of his death and the death of too many others. I will also tell you that a lot of thought and a lot of introspection is occurring in the local television news industry. Back in January, we co-sponsored a 3-day forum in San Diego with the National Press Foundation, where we did a deep dive on many of the issues that have been brought up already on this during this conversation, and came away with some takeaways on how to improve crime coverage. First of all, we didn't mention the Marshall Project specifically, but the work that you all are doing in this area is phenomenal. And we should have cited you at that time as one of our key takeaways. Rely on the Marshall Project for guidance and for help on ways to adequately report stories about crime without sensationalizing them, without causing extra harm to certain communities, vulnerable communities, and certainly communities of color. One of the main takeaways was, and these were local news directors, TV news directors from a variety size of markets all over geographically the United States. And one of the key takeaways was well, let me give you two key takeaways. Number one, do more contextualizing in crime coverage. Get beyond the sensationalism that can exist in local crime coverage and provide more context. And this speaks to something that Carroll was talking about and Susan was talking about just a moment ago. Yes, there were upticks in certain kinds of crime during and after the pandemic, but overall crime rates were down. So provide that context in your coverage, or similar context in your coverage. Another key takeaway was commit that if you start following a crime, if you start reporting on a crime from the beginning, you make a commitment and follow through on that commitment to report on that crime all the way through to its conclusion, no matter how many years that may take. That's a big commitment for local newsrooms to make, but many are now making it. And to get back to something I mentioned earlier, the major companies that own the majority of local broadcast, local TV newsrooms in particular, each have made commitments to have more people of color in more management and leadership positions, and are making extraordinary efforts to try to get managing editors at digital outlets, to get executive producers, assistant news directors, and corporate VPs of news. And I think the more progress we make in that area, the better our coverage will be overall. Was the coverage in 1989 and in subsequent years in this particular case fair? In many cases, unfortunately, no. In many cases, unfortunately, it was sensational. But the industry as a whole, with a few exceptions, is really trying to make an effort to do better. And we're proud to be part of an effort to lead in that area and really make local coverage more comprehensive, yet less sensational, and provide much more context and meaning when crimes occur.
All right. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Now we have some folks who specialize in the solutions part of this, and we wanted to go with them. We momentarily, Letrell Crittenden is one of them, and Letrell is with the American Press Institute, and he's got a lot to done a lot of work in this area. So Letrell, I don't see you right now. I saw you earlier.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you so much, Richard.
Great. Well, take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Richard, for having me. Again, my name is Letrell Crittenden. I am the Director of Inclusion and Audience Growth with the American Press Institute. It's a role that I've held with American Press Institute for about 2 years. And in fact, my work has really generated from, I was an academic, I have a PhD, I've been a researcher, but it all started in upstate New York when I was a police reporter. And somebody came to me one day, an African-American pastor said, "Man, you're racist." "What do you mean I'm racist? I'm a Black reporter. You got to be crazy." He said, "Look at your stories." I did. And what I was doing, even though quite frankly, incognizantly, was writing lots of stories about Black men who were getting incarcerated and not following up on their stories and doing it every day over and over again. So a lot of the work that I've developed with API, which we have a program called the Inclusion Index, is really based on that experience more than 20 years ago inside of a newsroom in upstate New York. And most recently, so basically the Inclusion Index, we use interviews with community members, we do interviews with newsrooms, we do observations of newsrooms, and we analyze content to really get an understanding of how in-depth issues happen to be within newsrooms. Because the thing is, when you're talking about an issue like crime, it's not just the actual coverage itself, it's how are you organized in your newsroom to cover crime in communities of color? What type of help are you and assistance are you giving to your reporters? And also, what type of engagement are you doing on a regular basis? So we actually just wrapped a project in Pittsburgh with 4 newsrooms where we worked with them on dealing with various issues related to covering communities of color. And crime certainly is one of them. For the sake of time, I'm just going to drop in the results of that particular survey into the chat box. Now, in terms of the actual questions, have things improved? My answer would be, not really. I mean, it's like people are putting salt on the chicken, but it's still overcooked, it's still unseasoned, and it's still dry. And quite frankly, a lot of the efforts that people are really making an effort to do anymore are quite frankly token. And I'm going to put it that way. Getting rid of mugshots, Nice, very easy thing to do. I like to hear hiring. We need more diversity in hiring. The numbers actually don't suggest that things are really improving, but that's just one step. But what we need is systematic reforms in how we actually go about beat coverage, what our beats are, doing much more community engagement and listening to the community, monitoring our coverage to see if there's overrepresentation of communities of color, and just in general, just keeping your eye on what you're doing on a regular basis to make sure that your coverage is not, as it is in Pittsburgh, 80% Black men as criminals or Pittsburgh Steelers, which literally a study just came up, noted that. So that's a little bit of a nutshell of what I've been doing. If you want to hear more, because my time is up, I will be speaking about this topic at NABJ on Friday with both Resolve Philly and the Maynard Institute. Thank you, Richard, for the time.
Thank you, Letrell, and thanks for keeping the Institute to account. Project, which is calling for media reparations. And we have two folks from there, and I'd like to hear their
Richard, we need you in front of the screen.
Oh, okay.
We're losing your audio.
All right. How about this? Okay, good. All right, stay right here. As I was saying, the Media Reparations Project is has definite opinions about this, and they've been working on this issue as part of their Media 270 project, which is in turn part of the Free Press organization, which is an advocacy group for media change. And so we have Collette Watson and Diamond Hardiman, who are here from that group, and I'd like to hear from them about the answer to those questions. Have things changed, and what remains to be done? So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you, Richard. And I would definitely pick up where Letrell left off in saying that, things haven't changed. For us, we understand the Exonerated Five as far from the first and sadly not the last time that a racialized false accusation has been levied against Black men. If we go back to 1921, for instance, we know that that was the year of the Tulsa Massacre. And what a lot of people don't know is that the Tulsa Tribune daily paper published an inflammatory front page article that accused a 19-year-old Black man of rape, which led to that violence. Now, the NAACP investigated and found that he had actually stumbled in that elevator, but of course, that information was published only in our Black newspapers. And then, of course, another part we don't take into consideration is that the Black newspapers in Tulsa were destroyed as a part of that massacre. And so when we look at the ways that the corporate and philanthropic sector have underfunded Black media, when we look at the violence that Black journalists and Black publications have faced, we understand that, as Elinor was saying earlier, like the New York Amsterdam News, there have always been truth tellers. In Tulsa, it was the Tulsa Daily Star and the Oklahoma Eagle, but they have faced persistent violence and persistent underfunding, and so that reparations processes are owed. And this is what the Media 2070 project, which I'm director of, exists to surface and to dream up in community. We know that the Democracy Fund issued a study showing that from 2013 to 2017, $1 billion in grants were awarded to the journalism industry, but just 8% of that went to so-called ethnic communities, women, and LGBTQIA+ communities. And so we're calling for two things. You mentioned us as solutions people, Richard. I liked that. We're calling for the top 10 print and broadcast media outlets as defined by Reach to devote at least 10% of their pre-tax profits to a fund to support Black and ethnic media. To redress decades of racially biased funding, we believe that philanthropic foundations should not only do this, philanthropic foundations should double their commitment to the journalism field overall, right? But should allocate 80% of this expanded support to institutions run by and serving communities of color for at least the next decade. And we understand that that is a bold statement, but we believe that this is part of a process of repair in direct response to the history of harm. And then the other thing that we understand as part of that media reparations process, which goes to my wonderful colleague Diamond's work, who's here on the roundtable with us, we understand that we should take a fundamental look at the crime beat and be curious about why it even exists. You know, after Ava DuVernay's documentary 13th, we came to understand private prison for profit, right? And the idea that these places are basically trying to fill beds. So we have to ask ourselves, does a so-called crime beat compel media organizations to fill a quota of crime stories, regardless of what's real in our communities? You know, what service does the crime beat provide? Using FBI data, Pew Research says that violent crime actually fell 49% between 1993 and 2019. And so we have a colleague, Tauheed Chappelle, some of you may know him formerly of the Philadelphia Inquirer, who wrote a piece for Neiman Lab called Defund the Crime Beat. And in that piece, he says that the crime beat is racist, classist, fear-based, clickbait, masking as journalism. And it's not reflecting, again, the truth of our communities, similar to what Susan was mentioning earlier with regard to the work of the Marshall Project. So Media 2070 Project, we're asking, what is the information that's actually needed to close gaps and correct injustice? How can we center the information needs of marginalized communities, like our good friend Kat Stafford did recently under your leadership, Ondale Gross, appreciate you, at the AP with her recent report laying out the lived experience of racial inequity from birth to death. You know, we believe that all of this is part of a process of repair. Oftentimes the word reparations is discussed as though it's a one-time payment or a check. But we understand that what has taken place going back to the time of chattel slavery through Jim Crow discrimination till now, and the role of media in that has been not only material, but spiritual and comprehensive. And so we're calling on newsrooms to pledge to care for Black communities and care for Black journalists. That means avoiding adultifying Black children, as happened in the case of the Exonerated Five. That means being skeptical of police narratives, with the same skepticism applied to any other source. And for Black journalists, that means trusting them when they move up and offer to tell nuanced stories, proactively creating space for paid time off and equal pay and other institutional policies, and assessing newsroom environments so that when we do hire more diverse folks into these environments, they're not so toxic and so abusive that folks are forced to leave the industry at the mid-career point. Diamond, I'll turn it to you though, if there's more that you want to share, because I know you're working hands-on day-to-day with communities on these topics.
Thank you, Collette. I really appreciate that. So my work specifically focuses on newsrooms and communities and their relationships to one another, and this history that Colette's talking about of harm and anti-Blackness in mainstream media and how that impacts communities. And I look at what are the steps that we need to do to deliver repair for our communities, so that we can have the stories that we need, so that journalism can be an enjoyable process for the Black journalists doing it and the people that are reading it and experiencing it. And I think Colette's right on about rethinking the crime beat and the way that it even functions and how that impacts Black people and how it's connected to a larger system and institution of ways of oppressing people. So I think a lot about the ideologies that cover a lot of the crime coverage that we see. So for me, I have the same answer as everyone in terms of, has crime coverage gotten better? Not really, because what I still see is youth being portrayed as violent. I stay in Chicago, so we see that a lot. Inherently, youth being portrayed as violent and as a group that need to be controlled. We still hear holiday weekends being quantified based on how many people were shot or injured over the weekend. We're still seeing mugshots, and one of the most questionable ones for me is the way that we value police statements and police authority. We still see people copying police press releases, police press briefings, police ride-alongs, when there's a long history showing that police lie all the time about what's going on and what the facts are there. So I think that that's still business as usual, and it really serves as a business for media companies. There's a saying called "If it bleeds, it leads," and I think that that's still very true in a lot of news coverage and media coverage. But what I really also wanted to talk about is the broader way that we see criminalization in news and media as well. So we have the things that I mentioned there, but in this era, there's also a lot of criminalization of humans and the way that we exist going on. If we look at the way that crime is covering trans folk and what's going on in local governments and the ways that media is talking about laws that are being put into place to criminalize gathering, to criminalize their existence. I think media really needs to check in on that. If we look about the criminalization of birthing people's autonomy when we're talking about abortion, if we look at the criminalization of history and knowledge with the CRT conversation that's going on, if we look at what happened in Atlanta with the Atlanta forest offenders. So I think if we look at the whole pie of what's being criminalized and how media is covering it, we really need to do an assessment of again, what purpose is this serving? And are we really talking about safety? Are we really providing information that helps people be more safe, feel more connected in their communities? And then on the flip side of that, we're also not talking about corporate crime. We're not talking about corporate theft. We're not talking about wage theft. We're not talking about environmental violations that are being brought on by companies and local governments. So really thinking about who safety is for and who journalism is for. And the reason that I say my thoughts on if crime coverage has gotten better are nuanced in terms of, yes, a little bit. I think that I'm pointing back to even what happened with the Exonerated Five, where the local papers that are committed to journalism as a service, the local Black-led newspapers are providing this information. That's why I have all these talking points. That's why I know the different multifaceted ways that we can talk about crime and safety. So I think it's a yes and when we look at folks that are using if it bleeds, it leads versus folks that are thinking about journalism as a service, we can really start to see the differences in how things are being covered.
Diamond. Elinor Tatum has her hand up. Go for it, Elinor. Unmute, please, though.
Yes. Hi. Yeah, I just wanted to add to something that Diamond was saying, talking about if it bleeds, it leads, and the holidays and quantifying them by how many people were shot. And the new initiative that we're working on at the Amsterdam News, Beyond the Barrel of the Gun, and talking about gun violence in Black and brown communities, and trying to reframe the conversation. And I just put in the chat a photograph of a newsstand in New York City right after the 4th of July weekend, and these were the front pages right after the 4th of July, and usually, we would have had something similar, not quite as bad as I think it was the Daily News. But after we launched Beyond the Barrel of the Gun, we wanted to go from if it bleeds to leads to solutions. And instead of having something about how many people were shot during 4th of July weekend, we went to what are the solutions to these shootings in New York City? How can we make a difference? How can we make a change? And so we put on the front page a person who was making a difference, and it was all about a documentary that we had just put together for the Amsterdam News and for Beyond the Barrel of the Gun about a guy named Belated who used to be involved in gun violence and now was stopping gun violence. So, Diamond, I'm right with you with what is going on and how we have to change that narrative. And that is something that we're working on. And thank you, Richard, for bringing up Beyond the Barrel of the Gun in your introduction to me, because it's something really important, and we're trying to bring that to Black newspapers across the country and to other places as well. Not only Black newspapers, but it's very important that we change that narrative, that we reframe the discussion on gun violence, because if we don't, we're going to continue to have these headlines that just keep people doing the same thing over and over again. We've got to go away from if it bleeds, it leads, because it's just it's not going to change the way people look at it. It's not going to change the way people look at our communities, because when they look at our communities as a place of violence, it's just going to continue that cycle. And it's going to continue the stigma and continue the generational trauma that has been imposed on our psyches.
Okay. Anyone else want to weigh in? I think Barbara Reynolds has her hand up. Barbara, unmute, please, though.
Yeah, I have a question. In Washington, 70 young people have been shot in our communities, and I'm talking about Black communities. And so if it is a white policeman shooting a Black person, there are the celebrities there, there's the politicians, it's big news. But I'm worried that what's going on in our communities is being normalized. I think that what I just heard is good. Yes, do the solutions. But when you can have these kinds of shootings in poor communities, they don't have solutions. It's not a big deal. It's not front page anymore. I'm wondering, is that right too? I mean, is that going to help the people looking for a solution? Their children are dying, and some of us don't want to cover this, and don't ask the mayors, President Biden, if it's high celebrity, he will call a person. What about these people whose children are dying young? I mean, this 12-year-old, she was shot in her own home. So, and her mother kept her in the home because it was too violent to go into the streets. So I don't think we have to downplay it. I think we have to show it as raw and horrible as it is. That's just me.
Okay. Who's got a comment on that?
Well, I actually do. I think it's not covering it. I think it's the way we cover it. And the way that we have been covering it hasn't changed what's happening. It hasn't changed who's paying attention to it. The fact is, when we have a mass shooting every single day, it may not all be at the same time, but we have dozens and dozens and dozens of kids in our communities across this country dying every day. But if there is one shooting where a whole bunch of folks get killed, how many stories will be done on that? How many days will that story go? How many hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars will be thrown at that problem? But the illegal weapons, the generational trauma, the PTSD, the lack of education that's going on in our communities, what resources are being thrown at that? No matter how many stories we've done right at this point, what's being done in our communities for those mass shootings? But they're not called mass shootings. As soon as they're called mass shootings, it's a different story.
Well, can't more journalists change the narrative? I agree with
that's what that's exactly what we're talking about doing. Changing the narrative. It's not taking it off of the pages, it's writing the stories differently. It's changing the paradigm.
If I may jump in.
Yeah, go ahead.
There's been an interesting debate this week about people panicking that newsrooms will lose access to their scanners. And I say that that's interesting, and this is the problem. People love to go out. I had a scanner when I was 23 years old in upstate New York. They go out and they'll cover that story, and they'll cover this shooting here and this shooting there and this shooting there, and they'll make sure they get all of them. But what they do not do is follow up on those stories, or even more importantly, tell everyday lived experiences, tell everyday stories of things that are happening in these neighborhoods, both positive and negative, that may provide some context as to why things may be exploding or improving within these neighborhoods. The basic formula is scanner says shooting here, go out, cover that, talk to some people, talk to some pastor or somebody else to say, why is this happening? And then rinse and repeat that cycle over and over again. We're never getting into, or we rarely get into great context as to what is happening within communities. And that is one of the things with the project in Pittsburgh that I really emphasize, is that you have to get out and tell everyday lived experiences. And maybe you'll understand why there's friction over this issue or why there's tension over this issue. Because right now, that same model of chasing the scanner has not changed, quite frankly, since the beginning. And I was interviewed for an article by the Inquirer by the Action News creation 50 years ago. So that is something that we need. We need more context as to what's happening with the everyday lived experiences in people's lives, and that'll add context to these stories and to these stories.
Okay, I see a hand. I say Dan, but let me get Ken Burns, and then Diamond, and then Dan Shelley.
Thank you, Richard, and good evening, everyone. First and foremost, I hope to see everybody in Birmingham this week. But a couple of things during this discussion, which is really, really good. One, I don't think much has improved in crime coverage because of the very reason that was just stated, that there's no follow through. You hear the scanner, you go out, you get the sound bites, and then you put it on television. The other concern I have is, we talked about digital, we talked about television, but we have not talked about radio. While most people get their news from television, you can't watch television while you're driving a car. And for a lot of radio newsrooms, particularly on the local level, there ain't a whole lot of us in the newsroom, people of color. WHYY, where I work now, is an anomaly. KYW, our competitor, they have a couple of people of color that I know about off the top of my head, at least on air or on the streets. But I also remember a time when I was in Baltimore, and for several months, I was the only one on staff, and one of two, including a freelancer. So while getting the numbers up, and as far as television and digital, that's important, the numbers need to go way up on radio, especially on the local level. I know much has been said about NPR over the years, and even they need to go up on a accelerated level when it comes to diversifying newsrooms, especially on the air. I mean, you could have producers all day, but what about the reporters who actually tell the story, who are actually your face or voice of the product? And then also, you could hire as many people of color in the newsroom as possible, even in some type of managerial position. But unless you empower them, I don't see much changing anytime soon. And that's my comment.
Okay, thanks, Andy. All right, Diamond.
I was just gonna expound on the question that Miss Barbara asked around crime coverage, and I wanted to emphasize what Collette had mentioned about when we're talking about defunding the crime beat, we're also talking about replacing it with something else that actually speaks to safety, that actually speaks to what keeps communities safe. And there's research and there's places of practice that show housing keeps people safe, access to food keeps people safe, access to jobs keeps people safe. But the way that media has spun safety in our country doesn't necessarily connect it to those things. So when Elinor is talking about how do we get resources, and earlier we were talking about how media resulted in policy in the 1994 crime bill, we're trying to use that potential to actually provide communities with the things that they need to actually be safe. So not necessarily turning away from what's going on in our communities, but giving it a new perspective so that we can get to the root of what's going on and have the platform and the public square to actually discuss it in a meaningful way. And the other thing that I would say is that on top of that, when we talk about the way that some journalists cover crime in communities, I just did a project on how that's also traumatizing for victims, the ways that journalists come and talk to them and interview them as if they're just a story and a product for some of the worst experiences that they've had in their lives. So how do we even tell that with more tenderness and care? And how do we equip journalists with more tools to really grapple with the violence that comes when something traumatic has happened in your community? And how do we talk to people about that and share their stories in ways that speak to their wholeness and their humanity?
Okay, Dan Shelley.
Well, first of all, I could not agree with you more, Diamond, and you too, Ken, on the comments you made. But I wanted to expand a little bit on Letrell's comment about chasing the police scanner and all of the angst that's going on in the journalism world right now because of what I call a pandemic of public safety radio encryption that's going on in America right now. And we are one of the preeminent groups. There are other press freedom groups as well who are fighting in New York City, fighting in the Bay Area, fighting in Chicago, fighting in small and medium and large towns all across the country to either stop public safety encryption or allow access to journalists to real-time police dispatch information. Ideally, we'd love to have the entire public be able to monitor it, not because we want to chase violent crime on the scanner for sensational purposes, but because police have become, and this is a broad generalization, it's not true everywhere, but in many, too many places across the country, law enforcement agencies have become much less transparent in the last 2 to 3 years than they ever were before. Encryption is a phenomenon that began decades ago, but has accelerated at pandemic pace in cities all across America. And it's happening because police, it's not always the stated reason. The reason they most often cite is, well, it's for officer safety. Journalists don't want access to police scanners to compromise officer safety. We want to know for ourselves as best we can determine what's going on in neighborhoods of color and other neighborhoods, because unfortunately, and I hate to say this in some respects, but it is the truth, you can't always rely on the police narrative. I mean, you go back to the news release issued by the Minneapolis Police Department the day after George Floyd died, and it sounded so innocuous and so benign. And were it not for Darnella Frazier, a brave 17-year-old girl standing on the sidewalk with her cell phone camera, the world would not have seen the full picture of what happened to him. But since the knee-jerk reactions of many in law enforcement, post George Floyd and others, Breonna Taylor, Philando Castile, fill in the blank here, there are so many of them, and it's tragic. Police, unfortunately, are moving toward less transparency, not more. And what we need is more transparency, not less, specifically so that we can see for ourselves what's going on when crime occurs and when other public disasters occur, so that we can see for ourselves and report the best factual information to the public. That's critical in this era where you cannot, unfortunately, trust every law enforcement agency the way you used to be able to do.
Okay.
May I respond real quickly to that?
Yes.
I agree that there needs to be surveillance of what police is doing. That I have absolute agreement with you with that. However, the problem is that if we're being honest, the police scanner for many newsrooms is the greatest tool of community engagement they have with communities of color. That is the only time they will go into these communities at all. So yes, there is the more benevolent reason that you're seeking to have the scanner. But my point was that in 9 out of 10 cases, that scanner is used to go into communities of color and report on Black harm. And in 8 out of 10 of those cases, there's no follow-up to try and understand what's going on. So I'm not saying that the police scanners shouldn't be available, but the problem is how newsrooms use the police scanners and how they use them at the expense of communities of color and covering more deeply communities of color.
And I agree with you, by the way, that if you are a newsroom and you're using police scanners, that shouldn't be your only reason for going into communities of color and examining issues that are unique to them and issues that are impacting lives there. I didn't mean to suggest that. And for newsrooms that still follow, that's the old-fashioned way of doing it. For newsrooms who still follow that practice, and this also speaks to if it bleeds, it leads. That is a paradigm that has changed somewhat, but needs to change more, because in too many markets, that's still happening in television news, and it's not right.
Doesn't bring ratings though.
Well, yes and no. Sometimes it does, but sometimes it doesn't. I mean, we've done research that shows that people do want to know about crime, but they don't want to see superficial reports about random acts of violence that don't affect the greater community. I'm saying I'm agreeing with Letrell in that when we do use scanners, when we do go into underserved communities, we need to do so for more and better reasons than just finding a story that bleeds so we can lead with it. We must do better as an industry, and we're trying to encourage local newsrooms to do so.
Okay, we're going to go to Wanda Lloyd as a question, but first let me just clarify what you were saying, Dan, about the scanners. In other words, many cities and jurisdictions are trying to encrypt the scanners so that the public and the press cannot listen in. Is that what you're saying?
That's correct. And it's not some, it's an alarmingly growing number. It's in California, it's in New York City now, and it's in every town, small and large, in between virtually every city. Every community law enforcement agency is doing this, and it's leading to less and at the same time, running in parallel to this is a new role of the public information officer at too many law enforcement agencies. They exist to be PR shills for law enforcement agencies, not to tell the full and honest truth to the public and be transparent. I'm not saying every law enforcement agency is that way, but too many are. That in parallel with what's happening with encryption, it's creating less transparency, less trust of law enforcement, and more harm to communities that need to feel safer and have legitimate concerns about how they're portrayed to a wider spectrum of the community.
What reasons are they giving for wanting to encrypt?
They're saying most of the time officer safety. There, in the case of Chicago, former Mayor Lightfoot, her excuse when she started the project a few years ago was bad guys are getting a hold of police radios and interfering in police communications. Well, pardon my language, but that's BS. That's not what's happening to a large degree. I'm not saying that's never happened, but that's not a reason to encrypt police communications. It's just not.
I hear you. All right, Wanda Lloyd and then Carroll Bogert.
Hi, everybody. Excuse me. I want to speak from a leadership position, and I'm really glad to see my friend Jill Geisler on here because all of her work is around leadership. I worked at a couple of very large national publications, but I became a leader at two smaller publications. And when I was a managing editor in Greenville, South Carolina, and executive editor in Montgomery, we realized that this having the photograph and the stories of whoever was arrested overnight for whatever crime, whether it was a shooting or robbing or car accident, and running the mugshots on page one was doing harm to the community. And it did speak to that psyche in our community. And I reached out in both cases when I was at both of those newspapers at different times to the police department, the police chief, in fact, and brought them into the newsroom and had meetings with them, with our editors in our editors meeting, and to talk about what this does in the community. And they admitted that statistically more African-Americans at that time, because these were both the majority were Black at that time, were more African-Americans were committing the crimes, but that did not mean, but they were also hearing from people in the community that this was, this stereotype was harming them. And so having this conversation, I made a leadership decision that we were going to take the mugshots of all criminals, except for those who were at large and a threat to society, off of page 1. And that was a big leap for our staff, especially our night staff, who always said to me, you know how long it took us to go down to the cop house and wait for that mugshot and get that story? And I said, you can put it in the paper, just don't put it on page 1. And I don't care what race it is. It didn't matter. It wasn't just African-Americans that we banned from the paper, but that really made a difference. The other thing we did, though, is in both communities, I hired a bus. I got a bus and a historian and took them into the Black community. The entire staff took 2 or 3 bus loads to do this over time. I paid a historian to just talk about the richness of the Black communities, because so many of our non-Black staff members were afraid to go into the community unless they were covering crime. And they didn't really know about the rich stories and the fact that the families there who were, maybe some of them were in service jobs, were really working really hard to make sure their kids got a good education and got a fair shake in society, and that they didn't end up on page 1 in a crime story. So I just want to urge you to, first of all, to understand that it takes leadership. And in our case, we had someone who, I was African-American and a leader in the newsroom. It also takes staff, but everybody needs to be responsible. This should not just be the responsibility of reporters of color, editors of color, to solve this problem. But first they have to know those communities and they have to feel comfortable going in those communities. And then the leadership piece is really important. So I just want to sort of put that out. I applaud all of you who are coming up and coming out with suggestions of solutions, and it really should be a solution-based conversation. And I appreciate that. But think about the leadership and how some of us can make a difference just by being leaders in our newsrooms. And you don't have to be the editor or the managing editor to take a leadership position. You can take a committee position. There are lots of ways to do that. Thank you.
Here, okay. All right, Carroll Bogert.
I just wanted to respond to a couple of things, great points made by others. I so appreciate this conversation. One of them is just about, I think we do have to recognize the change in the information landscape since the time of the Central Park jogger case. Even if the media were to, for example, stop covering crime altogether, as was suggested to me. I was on a panel recently with someone who said, why does the media have to cover crime at all? We have to recognize that other entities, other non-journalistic entities will circulate that information. We don't have the monopoly on how people understand crime and what they know about crime that we once did. People are getting information from, Nextdoor or online sources, all kinds of different ways. People who don't check their facts are not professionally trained. And, that does create additional pressures on our industry. It's not to exonerate, so to speak, journalists from covering crime badly, but just to say there are a lot of non-journalists who cover crime badly and whose information reaches the consumer in some dangerous ways. The other thing I just wanted to say, Dan Shelley mentioned the conference in San Diego of TV news directors from around the country. It was a fascinating event. And I spoke at the conference, and afterwards a guy stood up and he had a question. He said, how do you think cell phone footage and 24/7 security cam footage has affected television news and the coverage of crime? And one does one's best sometimes to answer a question out of the blue like that. And I said, well, it's because of cell phone coverage that we know about the murder of George Floyd. We had evidence that he was murdered. And, in general, it increases transparency. And then I had that feeling that you get sometimes when you realize the questioner knows more about the answer than you do. So I said, how do you think, the inrush of all of this footage, or the availability and the existence just of all this footage, has changed crime reporting? And he said, we could do our whole newscast on crime. And it's not the footage that you remember from the days of yore, when it was, the crime scene with the yellow police tape and the blinking lights of the police car. That's what a lot of crime coverage is based on. Now it is coverage of the crime taking place, the shooting in the middle of happening, the assault actually taking place. And he said it's created enormous pressures on us because some of that footage is so compelling. And he was at this conference because he himself wanted to do better. He knew that TV news coverage of crime was a real problem. But he did say there are these countervailing forces upon us that we can cover crime all day long with the amount of footage that people are constantly calling to offer us at the station. So I don't mean, many positive kind of comments have been made and helpful suggestions here. So I'm sorry to add another dark observation, but I thought that might be worth sharing. I hadn't thought of it myself until that fellow raised it.
Thank you, thank you. Collette, we're going to get you in a second. I want to ask David, though. David, you've been listening to all this and people's various statements about whether things have changed or not changed. I'm just wondering what you make of this. Are you satisfied that you think that what happened back then wouldn't happen now?
No, I think everybody sounds to be in some level of agreement that while some say there's improvement, it might be mild improvement. Most people don't think there's been much improvement at all. I think the general gist of what I'm getting from everybody's conversation is that if something as tragic happened to the Exonerated Five back then, I'm not so sure that the media would act any differently. Here we are 30, 40 plus years later. And while there seems to be a lot of suggestions and there seems to be a lot of sort of little cells of people trying to make improvements on the problem, I don't think it has had or taken a hold on the greater aspect or the greater journalism as it is. So what I mean is, just sort of lost my train of thought. But my point is that we're talking a lot about local news and how local news would cover certain stories. But in my opinion, I still think that national news is going to cover things the way that it's always been covered. And it's, again, going back to whether society wants that sensational story. And I think at the end of the day, that's what the media is going to give the people, because that's essentially, I think somebody had mentioned it before, that's essentially what sells, what's what people are interested in. And I think it's very interesting that multiple people have mentioned that the lack of follow through, the lack of what happens to the people that you first report on, whether they get convicted, whether their case gets dismissed, whether they get convicted and then later exonerated. I think it's extremely interesting that everybody sort of has the same take.
Okay, thank you. Well, Collette, I'm going to get right to you, but I have one more question for Dan. It comes from the chat. What about the politicians' role in all this in terms of cutting off access to the scanners? Are they supporting the police in this, or the other citizens? Have you heard much from public officials about this?
We have in California a state senator from Palo Alto. Palo Alto is the exception rather than the norm. They did fully encrypt all of their public safety dispatch channels. But then post George Floyd, they decided, wait a minute, we need more transparency to be effective law enforcement and public safety agencies, not less. So let's unencrypt. Now, they do go to great pains to keep personally identifiable information private, to keep tactical information private during hostage situations, other sensitive, the service of search warrants, et cetera, where you don't want a suspect to be able to hear precisely where the officers are and what their tactics are going to be. But he has introduced legislation last session in the California state legislature. He got all the way to the final step before final passage, before it was killed, when law enforcement agencies came out of the woodwork to say we can't afford to unencrypt. So the version of the legislation he's proposed this year that's now in the California Senate would require that the state of California help local agencies fund the unencryption of their public safety radios. Surprisingly, a lot of public safety agencies, and I'm looking at folks in Pittsburgh in particular, but there have been other municipalities and other government entities as well across the country, found a way to use some COVID relief money that was left over to encrypt their police communications and their dispatch channels. In New York, where we're fighting against NYPD encryption, which has begun in Brooklyn, and which the mayor said today is likely to continue throughout other boroughs. The city council is members of the city council are very alarmed by this. So some politicians have agreed with us. We have gotten some nodding of the heads in support on Capitol Hill from some key lawmakers. So the window is slightly cracked open, but we need more politicians to get on board and understand that the issue here is transparency, not trying to thwart public safety or do harm.
Very good, thank you. Okay, Collette and then John Yearwood, then we're going to go to our introductions.
Thank you, Richard. I think that Carroll's point regarding the influx of video footage is an interesting one that I think about a lot too. I remember seeing the Rodney King video, which I know you all remember too. And it was at a time, in the 90s when it was the beginning of video cameras becoming cheap and accessible enough that people had them in our homes. And that was new. And I remember I was very young, and I remember feeling like, finally, we're going to get justice because there's video. They can't deny it now. They can see it. Police murders and police brutality of Black people is over. We won. I remember I was a child and I thought in that way. And we obviously see that hasn't been the case. So we have to ask ourselves, why? Why hasn't having this preponderance of video evidence changed what is happening with regard to, murders of unarmed Black people and other types of police violence? And I think it's because systemically we haven't disrupted our idea of what public safety even is. Going back to the earlier points, and media goes a long way to shaping our culture and what we think it is. Here in Phoenix, Arizona, where I'm based, organizers say, they ask us to consider the question, safety for who? And safety from what? And right now, I think the way that question gets answered by our policymakers and by our media system largely centers safety for rich white folks and their property, and how we keep them safe from Black folks, from queer and trans folks, from immigrants, and anyone else who has been identified as a threat, And so I look at that as a history of harm. Media 2070 Project calls it that. And so if we want to treat that condition, the common sense thing to do would be to center those who've been historically identified as that threat. So in that way, then if I take that question I just asked, now we're centering, let's say, the information needs of Black children, like the Exonerated Five. So what is the greatest threat to Black children now? And I think Barbara was speaking to that earlier. The questions for us would become, where do Black children feel safe? Are those spaces resourced and invested in by our public sector? How can journalism question the allocation of resources and hold local power to account? Well, one of the ways we can do that is by telling with truthfulness and nuance the stories of what keeps Black children safe, Black disabled people safe, moving away from a mainstream audience to what Carla Murphy calls multiple mainstreams. And I'll drop the link to where she put that idea forward in our chat.
Thank you. All right, John Yearwood, and then we'll go to our introductions.
Okay, Richard, this is actually a question for Dan, and I'm wondering whether he thinks news directors and others even know or even care about the damage they're doing to a community's psyche by harping on this crime coverage that they're doing so excessively. Here in South Florida, I have a friend, for example, who lives in Key Biscayne. She would not come north of the city at night. So if there's something happening north of the city where she thinks because of all that she has seen on television, the north of the city is flooded with crime. If there is an event happening north of the city that I think she should attend, or even she thinks she should attend, I have to go and pick her up under a bridge between Key Biscayne and downtown Miami, so that she parks there, and then I have to drive her north because she just won't drive north because she's scared to death about doing that. So as a former police reporter, I know that it can be covered responsibly. Is there or even any movement to make these news directors more accountable?
In short, yes. Are they all acting accordingly? Unfortunately, not every single news director is, but many more than used to are. And that's the good news. If you take a look at our code of ethics and accompanying coverage guidelines at rtdna.org, you'll see that we preach the gospel every chance we get of responsible journalism, which includes, among other things, being sensitive to crime victims and being sensitive to victims of fire, victims of any tragedy, being sensitive to borrow from the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. And that's something that we are offering trainings about, we're preaching the gospel of, and I have seen some shifting in the industry in that direction. Is it enough? Frankly, no. But yes, we are paying attention to that, and we are trying to make a positive change.
All right. All right, now we're going to go to our introductions. And I want to ask those who have not spoken to speak up now. John, why don't you introduce yourself? John,
okay. Is that me, Richard?
That's you.
I'm not sure how many Johns are on. But I'm John Yearwood. I'm editorial director for diversity and culture at Politico, former board member of NABJ, and I hope to see many of you in Birmingham in a few days, and also former chair of the International Press Institute in Vienna, Austria.
Very good. Thank you, John. And now, speaking of another John, John Watson.
Hi, I'm John Watson. I'm a journalism professor at American University. And by the way, for 20 years, I've been teaching aspiring journalists to reframe crime coverage, not as incidents of bad actions, but failures of the government to prevent crime. If we focus on the police responsibility to chase down the criminals, we're missing the point. Police can't prevent crime. Society has to prevent crime, and we have to reframe how we cover that. Thank you.
Good point. Okay. Charlie Cobb.
So, good evening, everybody. I'm Charlie Cobb. I'm a retired journalist, now book author. I came from a lot of different agencies, NPR, Frontline, and for my long term in terms of actually being employed, it was with National Geographic magazine for 15 years, where I was bouncing all over the world. This has been a fascinating discussion to me. I'm listening in because I'm just interested in what the thinking of today's crop of journalists is, since I'm no longer really in the business, and the people I know the best are old like me. I wish there had been time, and maybe that's another discussion, I'll say in conclusion, to where you could have talked about media culture. I think that the problems that you describe in media coverage of crime has to do with a culture in media that disregards poor Black and brown communities, where the bulk of violence and crime. And I don't think these communities are important to the media and their consequences for that, which is worth probably a whole evening of discussion.
Well, it comes up in many different contexts, and this is just one. But I did want to tell people about your book,
Oh, wow.
It's a few years old, but it gives some context to this whole gun discussion, because you're talking about in this book is well, you can tell us what you're talking about, what it has to say
Right.
about guns and access
Well, I
to guns.
appreciate you flashing the book first. The book in real simple and short term. I was a field secretary for SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, for 5 years in Mississippi in the early 1960s. The book is really a book about organizing at the grassroots in rural communities. And if you know Southern communities, we were protected by farmers and the like who had guns. And I ascribed the balance between being a part of a, quote, nonviolent movement and a culture which supports self-defense. I'm talking about Black culture here and Southern culture. And the book just probes that for 300 pages. Lots of stories in it because my background is not academic. I've been a reporter since my early 20s, and I like to tell stories. And I know a lot of the stories of the South, especially the stories about guns.
There you go. Okay, thank you. Jackie Green, who is my co-pilot in this. Jackie, please introduce yourself. You're the producer of this Zoomcast.
Thank you, Richard, for the opportunity. I am, as Richard said, I'm semi-retired from USA Today. I was on the founding team there on the NABJ board for a number of years, and I was the Unity president. I just think this was a fascinating topic. There's several things that I think that we could continue to explore here. We could have gone on for another hour on this particular topic, particularly when you contrast what happened over 20 years ago with how crime is being covered now, even with the additional videotape and a camera everywhere. Not much has changed. I agree with the attorney that you could have put this situation in Central Park, and I'm not sure the national media has learned a lot.
All right. Okay. Sheila Solomon.
Good evening, everyone. And yes, I've got to reiterate what others have said about this fascinating conversation. I'm the president of the board of directors of City Bureau, where we are trying to do more in helping the media, but also the community understand how to do better at telling just what we're all talking about this evening and learning about. And I so wish that I'd had some colleagues with me tonight, but I will be spreading the word. Thank you.
We should say what city you're in, since it's come up.
Oh, city. Well, I'm in Chicago.
There you go. All right. Okay, Chicago is in the house. Hazel Trice Edney.
Yes, good evening, everyone. And for some reason, I don't know why, but I couldn't get my video up this evening, so I'll work harder to do that next time. I guess you can hear me though. I'm Hazel Trice Edney, editor-in-chief of the Trice Edney Newswire and president and CEO of Trice Edney Communications. I want to invite everybody to take a look at my new website, triceedneywire.com. I also teach multicultural media history at the Kathy Hughes School of Communications at Howard University. And this fall, I'll be also teaching media entrepreneurship.
What did you think about the comments that were made about the Black press?
You mean tonight?
Yes.
Well, the Black press has constantly, first of all, I give my hats off to the editor-in-chief of the Amsterdam News. The Black press has constantly been, there for us and has always led the way when it comes to teaching on the evils against Black people. And that includes Black on Black crime. I just wanted to sort of add that flavor. I'm not sure if I heard the specific comments that you're speaking of, but we have always talked about Black on Black crime as being another evil against Black people, and continue to do that today. And it's not just the police killing of us, although we're really hard on that, and that has been a problem with racism down through the ages. We are constantly dealing with what we do to each other, and I think Dr. Barbara Reynolds can speak to that as well.
All right, thank you, Hazel. And Dale, I wonder if the conversation that we've had tonight fits into what you were saying in the beginning about what you learned about coverage of race in your tenure at AP.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I didn't say was I was a police reporter for many years before I got the opportunity to go into editing and then become the race ethnicity editor. And we have these very conversations at AP, and I really appreciate the conversation tonight because it'll help inform some conversations that I'll have here at the Star as we forge ahead. You know, the thing that I think was important here is that obviously we want to cover some of these things in our communities and how it impacts our communities, but everybody was spot on that it's how we approach it and how we don't you know, we have to have a more human approach, a more realistic approach to how we're covering our communities, and not just, you know, putting every story out when a crime occurs or a shooting occurs, but really trying to connect the dots and to really talk about the lasting impact it's had and start to get into some of the solutions and things like that. But I totally agree with the conversation around, you know, not putting mugshots in. I know that when I was at AP, I had a lot of hard conversations and fights when we would put up mugshots of individuals who were killed by the police in particular. When we had photographs at hand of them, you know, in their regular lives. And a lot of times we still hadn't determined what even happened in a lot of these cases. So, you know, I think it's important to fight on that front and to make sure that the language we use around conversations around policing in our communities and people that are part of the stories that we're telling, that we got to just take a human approach and really change the narrative. Because to one of the points I think Diamond made earlier, and Collette, you know, as we've learned from history, you know, just taking the police account for what's going on, we saw that a lot of that was just made up narratives. I mean, if it hadn't been for tape, we wouldn't have really known what happened with George Floyd or with Tyree Nichols and so many others. So great conversation. I'm so happy to be a part of it.
Thank you, Andale. Thank you. Robin Wilson Glover, are you there? We see your name.
I'm here. I'm here.
Great. Well, please introduce yourself and tell us if you have any comments about what you've heard.
Sure. And I can't get my camera to work either. It's just not. Oh, whoop. There we go. Nice to hear this conversation. We have this conversation in the newsroom quite a bit, especially on the. Say it again. Oh, I'm sorry. My newsroom.
Yeah.
It's NJ.com. It's an advanced publication. We're the largest media in New Jersey, in the state of New Jersey. It's for older people, it's a Newhouse publication. But we have this conversation all the time in the newsroom. I'm the co-chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee for our company. And we have it within, you know, people of color in the newsroom. And we try to bring that conversation out into the bigger newsroom. And we repeat things over and over and over and over again until we're kind of blue in the face. You know, continue the story. You can't just write a brief about something. You've got to continue the story. You got to get out into the community. You can't just go there when there's a crime happening. And it's easier to say it and harder for them to do it. And we're still working on it, you know, years later. It takes time, I guess. And we have recruited people and lost people because it takes so much time and effort to get this message across. And it's still just like beating your head across the wall. It's not easy. I will say this, we are starting a new publication. Its launch date is August 10th. It's an experiment called Mosaic. It's a spin-off website of NJ.com that will focus on people of color. We will not be reporting crime. We will be reporting aftermath of crime, talking to victims, talking to police about solutions. We will intentionally not talk about, I think someone called it random incidents that do not give a true picture of a community. So we'll see how that works out. We only have a small staff, but we have great intention.
Thank you, Robin. That was good to hear. Elliot Francis.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Yeah, Elliot Francis here, the former news anchor, reporter, television and radio, current host of Now with Elliot Francis on YouTube and Facebook. And I must say that from one who's argued the coverage of crime stories with more news directors and producers than I care to recall, I found this conversation important and just a fascinating conversation. We should do this again. So there you go.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Elliot. Karen Dunlap.
Karen Brown Dunlap, former president of the Poynter Institute, former journalist, former member of many journalism boards. Thank you, Richard, for another excellent conversation. I was interested, Collette and Diamond, in the matters of sort of redress or reparation for news organizations who either recognize the things they've done wrong in the past or have been called out. Matters like Deneen Brown's work with the University of Maryland students to talk about news organizations coverage, going back to, I think, the Civil War. Organizations like the British Guardian that stepped forward to say they could see the problems in their past. So what happens? It's kind of nice for you to say you messed up, but it kind of leaves you saying, well, gee, so what now? And maybe another time there's a conversation on what are some adequate means for redress? I heard you say about the 10%, but what else? What could be happening? My role now is still trying to matter by working with young people, primarily in Tampa, many of them, most of them in my bloodline, and also community building in Nashville.
Okay, thanks, Karen. I'll say that The Guardian has just announced that they are going to expand their coverage around the world of communities of color in various countries. So that's one step that they're taking. Brenda Wilson. Unmute, please. Unmute. Brenda, we can't hear you. Okay, all right, we'll have to get back to Brenda when she can unmute. Sharon Farmer, our photographer.
It's a really hot topic you all are talking tonight. I'm loving every minute of it because this reminds me of all the madness that was going on at the Washington Post, because everything led in the Metro was some crime, and it was too bad it was going to be at the bottom of the front page. I haven't forgotten. So I'm so glad to see people care about that. I am. Power to the people, people to the power.
All right. Yes. Melissa, go. Unmute, please.
I was kind of hoping you'd forget I was here.
We couldn't do that. Just introduce yourself, please. That's all.
Well, Richard, thank you so much for inviting me tonight. I have enjoyed this conversation. I have to apologize for my surroundings. I got kicked out of my office at the last minute. But this conversation has been really illuminating for me. And in a personal way, I'm just going to share it quickly. One of my first journalism jobs was at the Chicago Tribune, and Sheila, I think I used to work with you. And it was one of my first jobs, and I was. Yeah. Do you remember?
Yes, I do. Good to see you again.
I worked as one of the first digital producers and digital journalists at the Chicago Tribune, and I was trained by the old city news guys, the last generation of city news guys, and I love them and everything. But I worked so hard to internalize so many of those systems and structures because I was the new person, and it just occurs to me, listening to all of this over the last couple hours, how much unlearning it made me have to do later on. I have been on this, I have been learning rules so that I could get ahead in my profession. But now that I'm a mid-career person, I am recognizing how much of that stuff that I had to actually recognize and then push away from myself in order to become a better leader and to help build more inclusive newsrooms. So this has been just a wonderful conversation to help me understand that I made a lot of really good choices and probably started with some bad ones to begin with, but worked really hard to, I think, just bring more understanding to the newsroom on a local level, back in the Chicago Tribune and then later on when I went on to other organizations. So thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you. Joe Geisler.
I love what Mel just said about unlearning, because I do think that when we talk about systematic issues, when I talk with leaders in my role with Loyola University, or when I had with the Poynter Institute, or even back to when I ran my own newsroom, asking the question, are we covering events or are we covering issues? And how many incidents or events do we have to do until we realize that there's an issue there? It's easy to cover, it's cheaper, it's easier to cover that episodic incident than it is to actually dig into an issue. And I worry, as I said in the chat, that when we get into election season, people lose their minds. And suddenly we're talking about shorthand about who's soft on crime, who's hard on crime, and what in the world does that mean? Ultimately, it penalizes people because we're no longer talking about bail reform, or we're no longer talking about alternatives to solving crime on the front end of what generates it, and we're talking about punishment. And I just want to share one story that Andel talked about mugshots, and I think it's so important. In my newsroom one day, there was a story in our community in Milwaukee. A woman was found murdered, her body in a dumpster. We were given by police, who were trying to solve the crime ostensibly, a mugshot of her because she had had a record for prostitution. So what was the story that we had? A picture, a mugshot of a woman who had been convicted of prostitution. A reporter from our newsroom did the thing that we all dread doing, is doing the door knock to go talk to the family. People didn't answer the door, and he was going to leave, thought, oh, I don't have to do this horrible door knock, making someone uncomfortable by being the reporter asking questions. And neighbors said, oh, they don't use that door. They saw him trying to get an answer. They use the door around the back, go there. So he did. And when he did, someone opened the door and said, we're glad you're here, because that picture that's on television that you had, that's not our daughter. Here's a picture of our daughter. And they showed a picture of a mother and her children. And they said, we've been trying so hard to get her into a program for chemical dependency, and we couldn't. And this is what's happened to her as a result of that. And we went from having a story about a murdered prostitute to a story about a mother and drugs and systems that failed to provide help. And so I think that's that kind of story. That's a story about a system failure, not just about a crime. That's where we need to be. And please, as we get into election time, don't forget that when politicians or would-be candidates are trying to shorthand what the issues really are.
Thank you. That's a great story. Mary C. Curtis.
Hey, let me turn off the air conditioner. It was great conversation. Great to see my former New York Times colleague, Susan Chira. She spoke this summer to my class at the School of the New York Times Summer Academy, and they were really engaged. So we have a lot of young people interested in this. Mary C. Curtis. I'm in Charlotte right now. I will be in Birmingham. I'm a columnist at Roll Call, host of their Equal Time podcast, guest host for Slate's What Next, and Op-Ed Project Senior Leader. And I'll be moderating a panel on Wednesday at 3 for the NABJ Political Task Force on turbocharging your career. All are welcome.
Thank you, Mary. Darren Snyder.
Yes, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Richard. Another stimulating conversation. My name is Darren Snyder. I spent about 35 years in Gannett. About 33 of those was in sports. The other 2 was on the editorial page. So I never worked in the news section where police and crime reporters are, but in sports, there was some crime reporting as well. I really enjoyed the conversation. I enjoyed the comments from everyone from the project, the Marshall Project, and from the 370 organization. I'm a bit pessimistic sometimes, not in general, but sometimes on this issue because, leads and bleeds and financial pressures and clickbait and, trending stories. And, I'm just hopeful that some of the things that was talked about by people who are in the profession can help change the direction. I know that Dan said it's, he's talking about what the RTDNA is trying to do. And I know the job in print journalism is hard. So I'm watching from the sidelines as a concerned citizen. Thank you for having me.
All right, thanks, Darren. Brenda, can you hear? Unmute now. Can you?
Yes, I'm from
Yay.
school now. Hi, okay. I spoke with Richard about this a lot when he was arranging and organizing this, and I must say, after listening to it, I'm a lot more optimistic than I was before I tuned in. And my concern has been, sitting in a community where not so much children who have been harmed by this, but just in the past week or so, seeing 2 working Black men, one stabbed, one shot, people who were very warm and embracing of the community. I don't know who shot them, but I don't know to what extent this got addressed earlier before I tuned in, but from my earlier days as a former reporter, now retired, I started off in general assignment. But one of the things that I would do, it would be if something like this were going on in general, if there were, so to speak, a wave or something specific, whether it was the crack wars, whatever, I would essentially almost try to, embed myself, so to speak, in much the same way, reporters go off to foreign countries and stuff. I would just sort of immerse myself in the community, trying to get to know people, trying to understand. For example, when Boston grappled with some of these issues, there were just a whole slew of people who came together to kind of look at what was happening to the young men. As much as this, the Central Park Five was a misrepresentation of what is happening, I have a lot of concern for young men who may be engaging in behavior that is detrimental to the community, detrimental to themselves. And I want to know what motivates them. I want to know what drives them. And I want to know what can be done to help them choose other directions. And that's kind of one of the things that I see missing. Basically, my point of view, and a lot of people have shared it here, is you can't police your way out of this. This is kind of, I believe it's kind of, as a friend said to me, these young men are like canaries in the coal mine. They're telling us something about what is happening within the community, how the community functions or doesn't function. So a lot of people have talked about addressing systemically and holistically the community itself. Don't overlook the community, and that these young men whom I'm as much concerned about who are doing some of these things, whether it's carjacking, shootings. I just watched the videos of, shootouts. It's like a game or something, back and forth. I'd like to know, what kind of disconnects them from the reality of what they're doing. So I hope that someone did address this before I dropped in, but I think I have a concern for them as well. To what degree, I want to know to what dimension, how large, how great the involvement is in criminal behavior or not. I wouldn't overlook that. And I would do it with concern, not just so much to kind of lock them up and protect the community's safety, but also to address their needs as well. So thank you for a very good conversation, a lot of great ideas. It's nice to know that people are concerned about this and are addressing these things. Makes me feel a lot more hopeful than before I tuned in. So thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Brenda. Greg Morris.
Hi, Richard. Hi, everyone. My name is Greg Morris. I teach journalism at Hunter College, City University of New York. And first thing I want to say is that I really appreciate Richard getting me involved in journalism. I have, it's been really significant for me on somewhat of a spiritual basis, because I'm involved in a lot of fights at Hunter right now. And talking about fights, I've met Richard a long time ago in Rochester, New York, where the Black journalists had this big fight over all the things, all the racist things that were going on and dealing with, and brought in an ombudsman and stuff. And then Richard showed up at some point into the newsroom. I liked the way he facilitated things. He didn't like the newsroom, or he saw things better. And so he ended up becoming, if I'm correct in this, you ended up dealing with the editorial people. So I'm saying this again, that I'm really glad that I've been involved in this. I think everything that everyone's talking about is of real interest to me. Right now, I'm involved in a little litigation, so I have to be careful what I say about different things that I'm doing. But I hope one of these days we can do a little talk about whistleblowing. I can tell you as a whistleblower, I tell my journalism students the best about this. I'm going to make this real quick. Is you got to learn to keep a microphone with you at all times, and also a camera to be ready to take shots and expose. Thank you. I really.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Greg. Okay, David. Now you see that we actually have thought about this issue. So I hope that we've got some ideas here that people can work on and think about some more. Thank you all very much. We're a little over time. For those who are on the call, the chat room will be printed out and distributed, and then we will make a YouTube a version of this discussion for dissemination to whoever is interested. It'll be online. So thank you all very much. I hope to see some of you either in Birmingham or next month. We haven't decided the topic yet, but we're open to suggestions. And have a good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thanks. Bye. Bye-bye. Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.